Hey, what's going on, you guys? So in this video, I'm going to be working through practice test 1, modules 2, only the grammar questions, right, from the College Board's digital SAT practice tests that they offer on their website. If you want to download and take this test before watching this video, please go ahead and do so. It's not a bad idea. Remember, I'm not going to be doing as much teaching, but I am going to be kind of covering a lot of questions. And I will be sharing with you guys my thoughts, and I will be kind of explaining things here and there that I think are necessary to touch on. If there are any questions that you guys do want extra help with, or are still kind of confused about, or want a more specific lesson around, please write that in the comment section below. Otherwise, you guys, let's go ahead and jump into this test. Now, remember, a couple of general test taking strategies. So the first is when you start a reading and writing test, I like to start with the writing questions first, and the reasons are very simple. Writing questions take less time than reading questions. Writing questions are easier to get points on, right, than reading questions. Therefore, I can score more points. The possibility of me scoring more points is higher for writing questions than they are for reading questions, right? However, if I do reading questions first, there's a chance that I might run out of time or end up feeling really rushed and make careless mistakes when I start answering writing questions. So this is why I'll just kind of flip it, right, and start the grammar questions first. How do I know what the grammar questions are? Well, you'll be able to tell it's about halfway through the test, right? So on the actual test, you have 27 questions for reading and writing. So it's typically around question number 14 or 15 that you'll start to get a grammar question. How do you know it's a grammar question? Because it has this type of language, right? Conforms to the conventions of standard English. Standard English, basically telling you this is a grammar question, this is a grammar question. If you look at question number 18 here, we know this is a reading comprehension question. Which one most logically completes the text? So the reading section ends at question number 18, and the writing section begins at question number 19, right? So this is where I'll start. And so this is where I'll start on when I'm actually taking the test. And this is where I'll start answering questions for this video. Also, I tried to use a pen in this video, or in a previous video, but it was just a mess. So I'm not going to use a pen, but I'm just going to use my mouse and my cursor and just kind of like scroll over things and highlight things that I think are kind of important for you guys to know, okay? So I won't be writing anything down. I'll just be kind of highlighting things and just be giving you my explanations, orally. Make sure that you guys pay attention because there's a lot of things to cover. There's a lot of great, pieces of information, great tips, great strategies that'll help you guys to boost your scores guaranteed. Guys, the reason I do this is because I'm very confident in what I do. I've scored in the 99th percentile multiple times on the SAT and ACT exams, even the harder GMAT exams, for the verbal sections especially, and particularly. And I've also worked with over 7,000 students, so I know what it takes, and I know how your students' minds work, and I know the sort of the pitfalls and the mistakes that students make. And so everything that I do is really trained or designed to help train you guys to become better test takers, more confident test takers, to really see, right, improvements to your scores. Okay, so just trust the process. You pay attention, and I guarantee you, I promise you, right, that your scores have nowhere else to go but up. Okay, so question number 19, let's jump into this. So now, guys, before I jump into, so this is another tip, another test taking strategy for grammar questions. For all grammar questions except for the last two, like the transition questions. So except for these transition questions here, like question number 30, and for question numbers 31, these, the ones that have a long set of notes and then the student's goal you want to accomplish. So besides those two questions, what I like to do when I take a test is I like to, read, before I read the passage, I'll take a look at my answer choices. The answer choices will give me a very good clue as to what the SAT is testing me on for this question, right? So you know that you're being tested on verbs, right? And so knowing that, and I also know very specifically what verb concept the SAT is testing me on because I've just trained myself to do this. So pay attention to the answer choices first to get a sense of what it is the SAT is testing you on. and then jump into the passage. Okay, so here, the SAT is testing me on subject-verb agreement. If you want to write that down, you can. I notice I have a singular verb here for answer choice C, and I have a plural verb here for B. So now when I read the passage, I know I'm going to be reading to understand what the subject of this verb is. And then I'm going to get my correct answer very easily. So here the passage reads, when writing The Other Black Girl, novelist Z.D. Harris, this novelist, drew on her own experiences working at a publishing office. The award-winning book is Harris's first novel, but her writing were honored before. Okay, so the subject of this verb is writing, right? Any ing words as a subject is always singular, always singular. So I know that C is going to be my correct answer here for this question, okay? And that's because C is the only singular verb that I have. Were is a plural verb, have is plural, and are is plural, right? So has is the only singular verb here. C is my correct answer. Question number 20, if I take a look at the answer choices, I know I'm being tested on punctuation marks, right? And always sentence structure as well. So whenever you're being tested on punctuation, you're always going to be tested on sentence structures too. So I want to pay particular attention to the sentence structure, making sure that I have a grammatical sentence, right? Making sure that my independent clauses are all in place. I don't have a run-on sentence. And so when I read passages for sentence structure questions, in the back of my mind, I am kind of considering two things, right? Is this a complete sentence? And is this a run-on, right? And so that really helps me to notice, right, any sort of grammatical errors, right, when I read the passage the first time through. Let me show you what I mean. So it says, the Alvarez theory, that looks like my subject. I'll just think out loud. Developed in 1980 by physicist this person and his geologist son, Walter Alvarez, maintained, that's my verb. Right? The Alvarez theory maintained that the secondary effects of an asteroid impact caused many dinosaurs and other animals to die out. That's going to be where my complete sentence ends. So that's my first independent clause. So now if I continue to read, it says, but it left. Okay, so in my mind, I notice a new sentence appearing because it is a subject and left is a verb, right? So it left unexplored the question. I have a new independent clause. So I already know what the answer is here to the question. I already know that the correct answer is going to be B. Right? Now, why? Because A, C, and D, I recognize that those is all being wrong for the exact same reason. A, C, and D are all wrong because they're all run-on sentences. Yep. A run-on sentence, you guys, is when you have two complete sentences that are not properly punctuated. In other words, right, you need the correct, your job is to find the correct punctuation to put in between two complete sentences. Now, there's three different ways to correctly punctuate, right, two independent clauses. Well, there's a fourth way that I can kind of I'll mention to you guys. But the first way is with a semicolon. The second way is with the period. The third way is with a comma and a fanboy's word. Right? What's a fanboy's word? A fanboy's word, right, if you spell it out, F-A-N-B-O-Y-S, each of the letters in that word spells out one of the conjunctions, one of the coordinating conjunctions that you can combine with the comma to separate two complete sentences. So like F stands for for, A stands for and, N stands for nor, B stands for but, O stands for or, Y stands for yet, and S stands for so. So you can combine a comma with a fanboy's word. You have to make sure to put those together to separate two independent clauses. That's okay. But if you just have a comma, like you see in answer choice D, it creates a run-on sentence. If you just have the fanboy's word, like you see in answer choice A, it creates a run-on sentence, right? And so this is why, you know that B would be the correct answer for this question. Okay, so again, you guys kind of see what we're doing here, right? B would be the correct answer because it's the one that creates a grammatical sentence. Question number 21. I know I'm being tested on verbs, right? But more specifically, as soon as I notice to force and forcing, right, I know that I'm being tested on verb forms. Now, specifically, I'm being tested on sentence structure as well. It's one of the things I'm being tested on. So guys, whenever you see a to verb and a ing verb, right, one of the things that you want to think about when you're solving this question is sentence structure. So like we just looked at for the previous question, do we have a complete sentence? right? Do we have a run-on sentence? You want to consider that here as well. Okay, and I'll explain a little bit why later. So here, the sentence reads, in winter, the diets of Japanese macs, also known as snow monkeys, are influenced more by food availability than by food preference. Although the monkeys prefer to eat vegetation and land-dwelling invertebrates, those food sources, it's my subject, may become, so this is going to be my verb, right? So where does this complete sentence end? Those food sources may become unavailable because of extensive snow and ice cover. So my complete sentence ends right here. This is where my independent clause ends. Then it says, forces the monkeys. That automatically sounds off to me, right? Forces the monkeys to hunt for marine animals in any streams that have not frozen over. Okay, so whenever I'm solving grammar questions, I want to make sure to read to the end of the sentence, right? I'm just making observations here. I don't want to stop in the middle of the sentence and try to figure out what the answer is without paying attention to what comes afterwards. And that's because the SAT is really good at hiding clues or key pieces of information after the underlined portion. So always just get in the habit of reading to the end of the sentence, right? When you're solving grammar questions. And here you're just kind of making observations, right? So you guys heard me observe or note, right? Oh, A sounds really off when you plug it in, right? And that's okay if it does, right? I'm not going to solve the question right there on the spot. I'm just going to observe or note it, right? And the reason why A is, sounds ridiculous is because it violates a sentence structure. It violates, sentence structure, right? So it creates a sort of ungrammatical sentence structure, right? So now this is where I think I'm going to give you guys some top secret, top 1% information. Most students know that sentence structure errors, right, consist of fragments, incomplete sentences, right, and run-on sentences. So those are the two most common types of sentence structure errors that will appear on the SAT. However, there's a third type of sentence structure error that you guys must be familiar with, right? I categorize that third type as nonsensical sentence structures. So these are just sentence structures that are absolutely ridiculous and absurd, right? So nowhere in the English language will you have a sentence written like this, right? So I can give you guys, there's certain types of absurd sentence structures that you'll encounter. I'll just give you one example. The example that you see here with answer choice A. So that would be, if I said something like this, if I said, Jack is smart, comma, gets good grades, you would all recognize that as just being like, what? That sounds ridiculous, right? Jack is smart, gets good grades. That sounds absolutely absurd, right? You can say Jack is smart as one sentence. You can say Jack gets good grades as another sentence, but there's nowhere in the English language where you can kind of combine those two to make one sentence, right? And that's because you cannot have two main verbs, right, written like that, right? I can say Jack is smart and gets good grades. Or I can say Jack is smart, comma, so he gets good grades, right? But I can't say Jack is smart, comma, gets good grades. So you can't have two main verbs kind of formed in that way, okay? So it's going to be that type of sentence structure error that you want to be aware of, okay? Now, why is that important to know here? It's important because the independent clause of the sentence is those food sources may, so may is going to be my first verb, right? Those food sources may become unavailable because of extensive snow and ice cover. So I already have a main verb here. When I plug in answer choices A and D, right, forces the monkeys or forced the monkeys, now I have two main verbs that are not properly formed. When I say, those food sources may do this, forces the monkeys to do this, right? It's exactly the same as me saying Jack is smart, gets good grades, right? Same thing if I plug in answer choice D as well, right? Answer choices A and D, these are verbs that actually function like verbs, right? It's the present tense verb and the past tense verb. Many food sources may become unavailable, forced the monkeys, right, to hunt for marine animals. So those words are actually verbs, and you cannot have two main verbs like this, structured like this in a sentence. So you have to use another form of a verb, right? This is where we notice the ing forms and the to verb forms, right? So, typically you want to use the to verb. This is called the infinitive form. You want to use the to verb, or the to form as part of a larger verb phrase, right? So if I said something like, I had to force this, right? He wanted to force this, right? Wanted to force would be that larger verb phrase, right? Had to force would be that larger verb phrase. But, you wouldn't see, right, these two verbs kind of written by themselves as just random, as phrases in a sentence, So you wouldn't say to force monkeys to hunt for marine animals, as just like a phrase that's part of a sentence. So you wouldn't see these two verbs written like that, okay? On the other hand, ing words, and this is good to know, ing words oftentimes do show up, right, as, just separate phrases. So it's a common type of sentence structure that the SAT loves to use. They like to use a sentence structure where they have an independent clause, right? Comma and an ing phrase. So this is your independent clause. Then you notice you have the comma here, and then now you have the ing phrase, right? So they say the sentence, and then they kind of tell you, right, some additional piece of information using an ing verb, okay? And that type of sentence structure, you guys, does show up. I want you guys to recognize that as being grammatically correct. And it is a type of sentence structure that the SAT likes to use, right? So, you want to get used to it. Recognize that as being correct. How is this sentence structure being used? Like, what does it mean when it's used this way? Well, what it basically does, it just kind of tells you like an additional piece of information that kind of comes, that occurs right after or at the same time as, right, what the independent clause says. So if you think about it, forcing the monkeys to hunt for marine animals, this is kind of like an additional piece of information that happens or that occurs immediately after, like subsequently, immediately after this previous sentence, right? So the food sources become unavailable. So think about that, right? So no longer do you have food sources. And then the next piece of information, right? What happens next is the monkeys are forced to hunt for marine animals, right? So that's how these ing phrases are typically used, right? When they create sentences, when they're used as part of sentence structures like this. Okay, so this is why, you guys, C would be the correct answer for this question. Okay, a lot of good things, a lot of good pieces of knowledge. That was a question where I taught a lot, but I think there was a lot of important pieces of information for you guys to know. Question number 22. So here they're testing me on, using question marks, right? Direct questions versus indirect questions. So I just want to make sure, this is a relatively easy question. I just want to make sure, when I read the sentence, I want to just ask myself, right? Is this sentence being used as a direct question or an indirect question? Okay, I'll explain what that means in just a second. So the passage says, Lucia Michel of the University of Chile observed that alkaline soils contain an insoluble form of iron and blueberry plants that blueberry plants cannot absorb, thus inhibiting blueberry growth. If these plants were grown in alkaline soil alongside grasses that aid in iron solubilization, could the blueberries thrive there? Michelle was determined to find out. Okay, so what I notice here is this sentence is going to be really important. Michelle was determined to find out. Well, he was determined to find what out? Right? He was determined to find the answer out, right? The answer to what? The answers to this previous question. And so I know that in this case, this underlined blank has to be presented as a direct question. What's the difference between a direct question and indirect question? Well, first of all, a direct question has a question mark at the end, right, of the question, versus an indirect question, right, is more of a statement. So you're going to see indirect questions that have a period at the end of it. Okay, one step further, a direct question is basically when the person directly asks you a question. So if I said, what are you eating for dinner? That's a direct question, right? What are you eating for dinner, right? An indirect question, right, would be something, an indirect question, it's not a question that's asked directly, right? But it's a question that's kind of embedded. It's implied in a statement. So for example, if I say something like, I wanted to know what you are going to have what you will have for dinner. I want to know what you will have for dinner, right? So in that case, right, that's an indirect question, you know? Or if I say something like, I asked what you will have for dinner, right? So again, that's an indirect question, right? It kind of naturally blends into the sentence, right? And it doesn't ask a question directly, right? It asks a question indirectly. If I said, what will you have for dinner? Direct question, okay? So here you need a direct question because an indirect question doesn't make any sense, right? To say that as a statement, it doesn't fit logically with this next sentence, right? Michelle was determined to find out, okay? So here, that's the first thing. The second thing is, right, the word arrangement, the arrangement of words. So when you have direct questions, you want to have a certain arrangement of words, right? If you have an indirect question, you want to have a different arrangement of words, right? So if you look at it, okay, so first of all, with indirect questions, you want to have the subject appearing before the verb. So the subject must appear before the verb, right? So if you look at B here, the blueberries could thrive, right? This is written correctly, right? Because the blueberries is the subject and then the verb is could, right? So this is where the subject appears before the verb, and that's how you write an indirect question correctly. Hence choice A here is going to be wrong because the arrangement of words. Notice how we have the verb could that comes before the subject, right? Could the blueberries thrive is more of a question, a direct question, right? Not an indirect statement. Okay, so we can cross out answer choice A because it's not written correctly. If we have a direct question, right, we want to have the verb come before the subject. So answer choice D here is written correctly. Could the blueberries thrive? So we have the question mark, which tells us this is a direct question. And we also have the verb could that comes before the subject, the blueberries. Answer choice C, right, has the subject, the blueberries, come before the verb, and that's not correct in a direct question, right? So this is gonna, so we can cross out B, we can cross out A and C because they're not written correctly, right, as direct and indirect questions. And then from there, we know that we're going to choose answer choice D over answer choice B because this underlined blank, right, based off of the context of the passage, we need a direct question, right? Not an indirect one. So D would be the correct answer here. Question number 23. Take a look at the answer choices, and this is great. I know I'm being tested on verbs, but more specifically, verb tenses. Because whenever you see the will, the future tense, you guys, as an answer choice, one of the things you want to think about, right, is verb tenses, okay? That's one of the things you will be tested on for this question. Now, notice how the SAT can test you on verbs. You've heard me say this in a previous video, but we just saw that here. The SAT can test you on verbs in three main ways. We just looked at one, right? We looked at all three of them already. Question number 19. It's testing you on subject-verb agreement, where you have a singular difference between a singular and a plural verb. Question number 21 was testing you on verb forms, which is testing you on basically sentence structure, right? We cannot have two. And when you see an ing verb and like a to verb, right, you know that one of the things you're being tested on is verb forms and sentence structure. And then now we have the third way, which is verb tenses. So whenever you see the future tense, the will plus the verb, you know you're being tested on verb tenses, okay? So why is that important? Again, it's important because now it's going to affect the way that I read. So if you're being tested on verb tenses, what are the sort of clues that you're looking for, right? Well, the clues that I'm looking for here with verb tenses, I'm looking for, one, I'm looking for references to time, and two, I'm looking for other verbs. Show you what I mean. So here, the passage reads, in his 1963 exhibition of music, electronics television, Korean-American artist Nam June Pak showed how television images could be manipulated to express an artist's perspective. Today, Pak will be considered the first video artist. So here, I know that today tells me it's referencing a time period, right? It's referencing the now. You know, and so when you use today in a sentence, you can either use the present tense or the future tense, right? So if I say today I will run 5 miles, just means that you haven't run it yet. But if I say today I go to school, it's just basically telling you like a fact, So you can use present tense verbs and future tense verbs, right? When you have the time reference today, but you cannot use the past tense. So I know that B and C are going to be wrong here because I noticed the word to in the sentence. So now, next you just have to think logically, right? Based off of the meaning of the passage, what makes more sense? When you say today, Pak will be considered the first video artist, it doesn't make any sense, right? Logically, your brain goes, what? It's like what he's gonna go to get rewarded, or he's gonna get honored, right? And he's gonna go to some big ceremony, and he's gonna get honored as the first video artist. No, right? So you don't want to use the future tense here. It doesn't make logical sense, right? Based off of what you read here. So you know that D would be the correct answer. Just using the simple present tense, right? It's going to be fine. Okay. Question number 24. Looking at the answer choices, I notice punctuation marks like a period. So I notice I'm being tested on punctuation. Whenever you're tested on punctuation, you're always being tested on sentence structure as well. So again, remember the sentence structure you want to think about. Consider sentence structure in the back of your mind, right? Is this a complete sentence, right? Is this a run-on? Okay. And that's kind of how you're reading. So here, show you what I mean. The first computerized spreadsheet, this kind of looks like my subject, the subject of the sentence. Then we have a comma and a Dan Bricklin's VZ calc, comma. This is going to be what's called non-essential information, right? So when I'm reading for sentence structure or grammar, this is what I think about. This is what I observe. This is what's going on in my head. The first computerized spreadsheet is my subject. Improved is my verb. So now I have a subject and a verb. Now I got to read to figure out where the sentence ends, right? So the first spreadsheet improved financial record keeping, not only by providing users with an easy means of adjusting data in spreadsheets, but also by automatically updating all calculations that were dependent on these adjustments prior to VisiCalc's release. Okay. Then it says changing so notice the comma here, right? So kind of think like, okay, well, the sentence ends right here, but you don't just want to stop. You want to continue to read, right, to the end of the sentence, right, where the period lies. Don't just stop at the comma, because remember, the SAT oftentimes puts important pieces of information after the underlined portion, especially for sentence structure questions. So read to the end and just make observations. What are you observing here? I'm observing to see if I have another independent clause. So it says, changing a paper spreadsheet often required. Ooh, right? So changing a paper spreadsheet is a subject. That's what goes on in my head. Required is a verb, right? Changing, required, and then again, so I know I have another sentence. Now I have two complete sentences, right? Changing a complete spreadsheet often required redoing the entire sheet by hand. That's where my complete sentence ends, right? So now I know for sure that answer choice A is a run-on sentence. Why? Because remember, you guys, a run-on sentence is when you have two independent clauses that are not properly punctuated. In this case, a comma is the only thing that separates these two independent clauses, right? Can't do that. Okay, so A is going to be wrong because it's a run-on. Now, I can use that same logic to get rid of answer choice B and answer choice D. Now, why? Right? Because again, the only thing, we talked about this in a previous question, right? When you have two complete sentences, the punctuations that you can use a period by itself, you can use a semicolon, right? Oh, and you can also use a comma, but you have to use a comma with one of those fanboys words. You can't use a comma with any other words. So I can't just use a comma and have words like prior to, right, VisiCalc's release, comma. I can't just do that because I still only have, right, these comma. I don't have the correct punctuation that separates these two independent clauses. Okay. And so that's where I know that B is also going to be a run-on sentence, and the same thing with D as well. It just kind of changes the sentence a little bit. It changes where the independent clause ends, but it still does the same thing. It still creates that run-on sentence, right? Changing a paper spreadsheet often required redoing the entire sheet by hand is a complete sentence, right? So I can get rid of D as well, right? Notice how, D kind of sounds okay because the word and flows really well, right, when you read the sentence, But remember, you have to have the comma plus the and. If you had the comma plus the and, that would be grammatically okay, So in this case, get rid of D too. And this is why C here is going to be the only answer that works. Now notice what C does. What punctuation mark does C use? C uses a period. So it uses a period to separate two independent clauses, right? It just so happens that the second independent clause just has this phrase prior to VisiCalc's release, right? Before the independent clause. And that's okay because you guys have seen a lot of sentences that have this phrase that appears before a complete sentence, an independent clause, right? So I like C here for number 24. 25, looking at the answer choices, what do you notice, you guys? So one of the things that I notice is as soon as I notice a difference between a singular verb and a plural verb, right? So creates is singular and create is plural. As soon as I notice that difference, I know that one of the things that the SAT is testing me on is subject-verb agreement. So now I'm just going to look for the subject of this verb, right? So if I read the passage, it says, in order to prevent non-native fish species from moving freely between the Mediterranean and Red Seas, marine biologist Abella and has proposed that a saline lock system be installed along the Suez Canal in Egypt's Great Bitter Lakes. The lock would increase the salinity of the lakes and creates a barrier of water most marine creatures would be unable to cross. Okay, so this one's interesting here. I have this, so the subject is the lock, right? But notice I have two main verbs in this sentence. I have the lock would increase. So the lock would increase this and verb, right? And create that, right? So when you have this, when you have verb phrases like this, where you have two verbs kind of combined, these are called compound verbs. So a compound verb is basically when you have two verbs that are connected by the word and, right? So in this case, you want to just make sure to use the same type of word for both verbs. So if I said the lock would increase and, so the lock would increase this, and I could say the lock would create this, right? But here, because I don't have the word would, I can just, you don't have to have the word would, the verb would. When you have compounds like this, it's also correct to say the lock would increase and the lock and create. Because naturally what happens is the verb would be implied. It would naturally kind of carry over. So it's okay to say the lock would increase and create this. It's also okay to say the lock would increase and would create this. Okay? So in this case, the correct answer is going to be B as in boy. Okay? So what the SAT is testing you on here is they're testing you on verb forms, right? So remember, you guys, whenever you're being tested on verb forms, right, you know that you're being tested on, so this one's a little bit kind of tricky because you know that it was kind of testing you on, looked like it was testing you on subject-verb agreement, right? But when you read the sentence, you know it's testing you on something else. And that's a very, very good tip. And this is how you know, you guys, I don't prepare for this stuff ahead of time, right? I'm doing this stuff in real time, right? But this is how naturally things work, right? So now what you know is, this is how learning takes place. You know that the SAT can kind of test you on more than one concept for a single question. They can also create like answer choices that might look like they're testing you on one thing, but can look to be testing you on something else, and that's okay. The idea is to kind of have a sense of what the SAT is testing you on, right? And then get into the passage, okay? That'll always be a better starting point than reading the passage first and then looking at the question and the answer choices, right? Because you won't know what they're testing you on if you jump into the passage first. Okay, so anyways, that was a good sort of lesson. It was a cool sort of a verb question because it was a little bit different from how they normally do things, okay? But just know that what they're testing you on here is what's called verb forms. And one of the ways they can test you on verb forms, we saw in a previous question, they tested us on verb forms and sentence structure. But here, they can test us on verb forms and with what's called, it is sentence structure, but more specifically, it's called parallel structure, right? So it's when you have these two verbs using the word and to connect them, you want to use the similar structure, the similar form of the word, the similar pattern of the word, right? And I just told you guys different ways that you can. Okay. So next question here. So looking at the answer choices here, guys, notice how I notice I have different nouns that come at the beginning of the answer choice, right? A says there are, B says two problems, C, commercial plastics, two problems. So problems is the noun, and then D is commercial plastics. So when you guys notice different nouns, when I notice different nouns at the beginning of my answer choices, I know I'm being tested on modifiers. What are modifiers? Modifiers are basically phrases that begin a sentence before the independent clause, right? So despite being cheap, versatile, and easy to produce, that's a modifier. A modifier's job is to describe something. Your job is to figure out what it's describing, right? So ask yourself this question, right? What is cheap, versatile, and easy to produce? You know? So when you have a modifier like this, the noun or the thing that the modifier is describing has to appear right after the modifying phrase, right? So in other words, when you read the sentence, when you think about it logically, you know that it's the commercial plastics, right? The commercial plastics, that is what is cheap, versatile, and easy to produce, right? So the commercial plastics have to appear at the beginning of this answer choice, right? Right after the modifying phrase, right? So notice how I know that D is going to be the correct answer. Modifier questions, when you recognize you're being tested on it, takes you 5 seconds to solve. I know that, watch out for answer choice C, you guys, even though you see commercial plastics, notice you have the apostrophe. That's not the subject, right? The subject in C is actually problems, right? Because when you have an apostrophe with a noun, it's kind of like it's being used as an adjective, right? Like, whose problems is it? Oh, it's the plastics problems, right? So plastics isn't the noun in this case, right? Problems is. So the SAT likes to create wrong answer choices like that, where they'll use the correct noun, but they'll place the apostrophe in it. Those are going to be wrong, okay? So we know that logically, it's not the problems that are cheap, versatile, easy to produce. It doesn't make any sense. It's the plastics that are, right? And then also watch out for answer choices. Like the SAT likes to sometimes create these types of answers, or they'll say stuff like, it is the commercial plastics, or there are, right? And these guys are always going to be wrong. You want to have the correct noun, right? The noun that the modifying phrase is describing appear right after it, okay? At the beginning of the answer choice, okay? So D would be the correct answer to this question. Number 27, looking at the answer choices here, I know I'm being tested on commas, right? But it's just only commas. How do I know that? One, I don't see any other punctuation marks. I only see commas, and I see them in different places. And then two, there are no other words, right? The words are exactly the same for every single answer choice. The only difference is the comma placement. Right? So that's how you know that the SAT is testing you exclusively on comma rules. So there's certain types of comma rules that you have to know. If you guys don't know the comma rules that are tested on the SAT, watch my previous video. I go over every single comma rule that the SAT tests. It's a 2-hour video, but it's worth watching because it explains everything that you need to know about commas on the SAT. So here, you guys, so specifically the comma concept that they're testing you on is what's called appositives, okay? Now, notice in the sentence, you have these two noun phrases next to each other, right? Plant cell biologist is your first noun. Then Yuri Lee, the name of the biologist, is your second noun, okay? The second noun is what is called the appositive. So Yuri Lee is the appositive here. The appositive is the second of two noun phrases when they appear back to back like this. The job of the appositive is to describe or to clarify the first noun. So it just kind of tells you who or the name of this plant cell biologist, right? And so now, why is that important to know? Well, it's important because there's comma rules, right, for appositives. So appositives The second noun can either be essential information, which means that you don't put any commas around it, like you see answer choice C here, or they can be non-essential information, which means that you put commas around it, like you see in answer choice D. Okay? So when they test you on a positives, usually these one comma answer choices are always going to be wrong. Okay? So you're either kind of deciding, is it no commas or is it 2 commas? Now, how do you know? Well, you know that based off of how specific the first noun is. Okay? So you actually have to look at and think about the first noun. If this first noun refers to only one, right, then the appositive or the second noun is non-essential, which means that D is correct, right? On the other hand, if the first noun can refer to more than one, so if there can be more than one plant biologist, right, then the second noun, the appositive, is essential, which means that you don't put commas around it, which means that C is correct. Okay, so guys, which one is the correct answer here? So plant cell biologist, can there be only one plant cell biologist or can there be more than one plant cell biologist? Right. There can be several plant cell biologists. Plant cell biologists can refer to more than one person, right? So because it can refer to more than one, right, we know that Yuri Lee is essential, which is why C is the correct answer for this question. Okay? You will most likely be tested on this comma rule for non-essential information. There's several types of non-essential information too that you also want to know. Then guys, I created a separate video on this. Please go check that out. It's long, but it's really, really helpful because it covers every comma rule that you have to know on the SAT. Everyone that's ever been tested. And I even go into explaining the types of wrong answer choices that you'll see. So in other words, I'll not just talk about the comma rules, but also talk about like comma mistakes that you want to avoid, right? Comma do's and comma don'ts. So that's a great video to watch for those of you who are having trouble with commas. Question number 28. I notice this is a transition question. Again, this is one of the only types of grammar questions that I won't read, that I won't plug in when I'm reading the passage, because I don't need to. So the sentence or the passage reads, small flat structures called spatulae are found at the tips of the hairs on a spider's leg. These spatulae temporarily bond with the atoms of whatever they touch. Spiders are able to cling to and climb almost any surface. Okay, so when you have a transition word that begins a sentence, you know that this transition word must show you the relationship between this sentence here, the sentence that's part of the underlined portion, and the sentence before it. So when I read the sentence previously, it says, these spatulae temporarily bond with the atoms of whatever they touch. So it's just kind of telling me what the spatulae do, right? What the hairs do on the spider's leg, right? They kind of bond, they attach with the atoms of whatever they touch. Okay, so it tells me their function. Then the next sentence says, spiders are able to cling to, so they can actually attach to and climb almost any surface. Okay, so when I think about the relationship between these two sentences, the second sentence is kind of telling me some kind of effect, some kind of consequence, some kind of logical consequence of the previous sentence. So the second sentence is a result of the first sentence, right? The first sentence told me that these spatulae, right, can bond. They're able to bond with any atoms of whatever they touch. And so what's the logical consequence or the logical result of that? Oh, therefore, spiders can cling like Spider-Man, right? They can cling to and climb any surface, you know? So here, I know that the correct answer is going to be a cause and effect, or D, right? Moving on. So in November 1934, this person was living in what must have seemed like the ideal city for a young artist, Paris. She was studying firsthand the color-saturated style of France's modernist masters and beginning to make a name for herself as a painter. This person longed to return to her childhood home of India. Only there, she believed, could her art truly flourish. Okay, so again, I have a transition at the beginning of a sentence. So I'm looking at the previous sentence here, right, and this sentence here. when you have a semicolon here, I think really just looking at this first independent clause before the semicolon is usually enough, right? You don't have to look at everything, not yet, not initially, at least. Maybe you can go back to look at what the information after the semicolon says, but in the beginning, though, no need. So the previous sentence, what does it say? It says that she was studying firsthand the color-saturated style and beginning to make a name for herself as a painter. Okay, so what does it tell us? It's just basically saying that she was getting really popular, right? If she's beginning to make a name for herself, she's becoming well known, she's becoming popular, you know. And so now, what's the next sentence say? She longs to return to her childhood home. So, we know that she was in Paris and she's becoming really famous or popular as an artist. So naturally, logically, we would think that she would be happy where she is, right? But that's not what we hear. We hear that she's actually like kind of homesick. You know, she wants to go back to her home in India, right? So the second sentence is not a logical consequence. It's actually an unexpected consequence of the previous information, right? It's an unexpected result given what we just heard. And so in these cases, you guys, we want to use a special type of contrasting word, words like still, words like nevertheless. You know, words like still and nevertheless. Oh, I just got really close up for a second. So words like still and nevertheless, what they do is, just got to adjust my webcam. I have an AI webcam. Sometimes the AI kind of bugs out on me. So what the words like nevertheless and still do is that it introduces something that's unexpected or surprising given the previous sentence or given the previous information. So the second sentence is like an unexpected or like a surprising result, right? Given what we know prior, you know, and so this is why A here is going to be the correct answer. So now notice how you guys, you know, therefore, right? These kinds of words introduce like a more logical consequence, right? But then, you know, words like nevertheless and still, they introduce an unexpected or a surprising consequence. So they kind of do the opposite things, you know, so it's just kind of good to know or categorize in that way. Cool. All right. So question number 30, it says, before California's 1911 elections to approve a proposition granting women the right to vote, activists across the state sold tea to promote the cause of suffrage. In San Francisco, the Women's Suffrage Party sold equality tea at local fairs. In Los Angeles, activist Nancy Tuttle Craig, who ran one of California's largest grocery store firms, distributed votes for women's tea. Okay, so what do we notice here? I notice that I have a transition word at the start of a sentence. So I know I'm going to be looking at the relationship between this sentence here, the one about in Los Angeles, what Nancy Tuttle Craig did. She distributed votes for women's tea. And this previous sentence, right? In San Francisco, the Women's Suffrage Party sold equality tea at local fairs. Okay, so, but I don't just want to completely ignore everything that I read before, right? I do have to kind of consider what was previously talked about, because that type of context gives me a better understanding, right, of what this sentence is doing and the relationship of this sentence to the relationship of the next sentence, right? So, because of that, you know, when I look at the sentence here, the previous sentence, in San Francisco, the Women's Suffrage Party sold equality tea at local fairs. This is giving me an example, right? An example of how activists of the previous sentence. The previous sentence says that activists across the state sold tea to promote the cause of women's suffrage, right? Of voting. So we know that this sentence here tells us a specific place in California, in San Francisco, right? And so this is giving me an example of the previous sentence, right? The main idea or the main point, right, of the previous sentence. So I know that, you know, in a certain place in California, right, the Women's Suffrage Party, they sold equality tea at local fairs. So they're basically just trying to promote, right, voting by selling tea. So now in this next sentence, it says, in Los Angeles. So Los Angeles is another place in California, right? So it seems like we have another example in California. It says, activist Nancy Tuttle Craig, who ran one of California's largest grocery store firms, distributed votes for women's tea. So it seems like we have another sentence, right, that's giving us an example of another place in California, right, that's also, selling tea to promote votes. So if you think about the relationship between these two sentences, it's comparing. It's comparing two things along the same lines, right? So I know that the correct answer here would have to be similarly, okay? Because I know that look at how it's comparing two places. It's comparing San Francisco and it's comparing Los Angeles. And how do they compare these two places? They compare these two places in terms of what people are doing to promote, to selling tea to promote votes, right? That's what they're doing here, So yeah, so it is making a comparison of two things, right, along the same lines. This is why similarly would be the correct answer for this question. Question number 31. It says, a student is taking the following notes. The Saigon Tunnel is a rail tunnel in Japan. Gives me some information about this tunnel in Japan. It connects the island of Honshu to the island of Hokkaido. So it gives me a description of the tunnel, what it connects. It is roughly 33 miles long. So this is giving me another detail about the length of the tunnel, right? So then it says the Channel Tunnel is a rail tunnel in Europe. It's talking about another tunnel in Europe. It connects Folkestone, England to this place in France. So it's telling us about, the places that this tunnel kind of goes through. And then it is about 31 miles long. Okay, so remember, you guys, when you're reading over these notes, you're just trying to make note of these notes, right? Just trying to understand generally just kind of what's going on. So it seems like they're just talking about two different tunnels, right? And just things about two different tunnels. So then the sentence or the question says, the student wants to compare the lengths of the two rail tunnels. Okay, so again, what's the focus here? They want to compare the lengths. So how long the two rail tunnels are. The correct answer must do this and must be the one that does this the best. Okay, so A says some of the world's rail tunnels, including one tunnel that extends from England to France, are longer than 30 miles. Well, does it compare the lengths of two rail tunnels? No. If it compared the lengths of two rail tunnels, it'll actually have to tell you what the specific lengths of each tunnel is, right? So, let me just move this up a little bit. So we know that it's not doing that. So B says the Saigon Tunnel is roughly 33 miles long, while the slightly shorter Channel Tunnel is about 31 miles long. This looks really good, right? Why? Because the goal is to compare the lengths of two rail tunnels. B talks about, and choice B tells us the length of both tunnels, right? 33 miles long and 31 miles long. And it does kind of compare them in the sense that one's a little bit shorter than the other one, right? So B looks like it's really, really good answer choice. So let's keep it for now. We know that for sure A is wrong, 100% sure now. Let's take a look at the other answer choices. C says the Saigon Tunnel, which is roughly 33 miles long, connects the Japanese islands of Honshu and Hokkaido. So why is this incorrect? Well, because we don't know anything about the other tunnel, right? So we get rid of C for sure. D says both the Saigon Tunnel, which is located in Japan, and the Channel Tunnel, which is located in Europe, are examples of rail tunnels. Well, this is going to be wrong because it doesn't tell us anything about the lengths, right, of the two rail tunnels. So it's missing important information. So this is why the correct answer here would have to be B as in boy. Pretty straightforward. Question number 32. It says John Ching is a Los Angeles-based painter. Okay, so he's a painter. Who he is, so the name of this person and what he does, right? He uses the term fauna to describe plant animals hybrids that he depicts in surreal paintings. So introduces the term fauna. Fauna is a combination of the words flora and fauna. Just kind of tells us the definition of fauna, right? So what is a fauna? How does he use it? Right? His painting Nectar depicts a parrot with leaves for feathers. So it gives us an example of a painting, right, that has both kind of like animal and plant type of things. Kind of weird. And then the last note, his painting Primaveral depicts a snow leopard whose fur sprouts flowers. So again, an animal with flowers, right? So just giving us examples of paintings, right, where he draws fauna. Okay. So the student wants to provide an explanation, an example of fauna. So notice here, I notice that there's two goals. The student wants to provide an explanation of fauna, so telling me what fauna is, and wants to provide an example of fauna, so giving me details, right, about fauna. So A says the term fauna, used by Los Angeles-based painter John Ching, is a combination of the words flora and fauna. So answer choice A only achieves one of the goals. A gives an explanation of fauna by telling me what it is. It's a combination of the words flora and fauna, but it doesn't give me an example of it, right? So it just tells me who used it, but that's not an example. It's telling me the person who created it. So I know that A is going to be wrong. B says John Ching uses the term fauna, a combination of the words flora and fauna, to describe the subjects of his surreal paintings, plant-animal hybrids such as parrots with leaves for feathers. Ooh, B looks pretty good. Why? Because we have both things, right? He uses the term fauna, and then if you have a combination of the words flora and fauna, this is going to be your explanation. So he's providing the definition of what fauna is, and does he give you an example of it? Sure. He tells us about this parrot, right? This parrot with leaves for feathers as a plant-animal hybrid. So B looks really good. Just in case, let's look at these other answer choices. C says, John Ching, who created Nectar, refers to the subjects of his paintings as fauna. So C is the worst so far. C doesn't give us any sort of explanation of fauna, right? No definition of it. So let's cross it out. And then D says the subjects of Nectar and Primavera are types of fauna, a term that the painting's creator, John Ching, uses when describing his surreal artworks. So do we know what fauna is? No, right? It's still missing an explanation of fauna. An explanation of fauna is a definition of it, right? So the definition or the explanation of fauna is going to be this information here. It's a combination of the words flora and fauna, right? And so D, it looks like it's saying a lot, but it's not saying anything. It just uses a lot of words, but it doesn't really say anything. It doesn't really provide an explanation or an example of fauna. It tells us like the subjects of two examples of his paintings, but it's not as specific, right? It's not as specific as B, because a parrot with with leaves for feathers is much better because it's a more specific example than just saying the subjects of Nectar, right? So don't like D, right? Like B better. So B would be the correct answer for this question. Okay, lastly, it says, in the midst of the Civil War, Susie Taylor escaped slavery and fled to Union Army occupied St. Simons Island off of Georgia coast. So it tells us about this one person, Susie Taylor, and kind of what her escape during the Civil War. She began working for an all-Black Army regiment as a nurse and teacher. So it tells us what she did, like her career, or what she did when she was there. In 1902, she published a book about the time she spent with the regiment. So she wrote a book about this. And then her book was the only Civil War memoir to be published by a Black woman. So it's pretty significant, right? It's the only book published by about the Civil War, published by a Black woman. It is still available to readers in print and online. So we can still get access to it now. And that's it. So remember, you guys, when you're reading over the notes, don't try to read everything in so much detail. Don't try to memorize everything too. Just get a sense of what each note is talking about, right? Just make a note of the note. So the question says, the student wants to emphasize the uniqueness of Taylor's accomplishment. Ooh, so key words, right? Make sure, you guys, that you do your best to understand exactly what it is the student wants to achieve. If you don't know what the goal is that the student wants to achieve, the chances of you getting this question incorrect go way up. So make sure to spend some time really thinking about what it is that the student really wants to accomplish. What is his goal? So here we know that the goal is to emphasize the uniqueness of Taylor's accomplishment. So what does it mean to be unique? Unique means that you're the only one doing something, right? No one else, you're very different or distinct, right? So we know what that kind of point is going to be, right? It's going to be this one here where it's the only memoir. That's how unique it is, right? But that's what I'm kind of thinking right now. But if you haven't made that connection, it's okay. As long as you kind of just clearly know what it is the question is asking you, should be enough. So answer choice A says, Taylor fled to St. Simon's Island, which was then occupied by the Union Army, for whom she began working. Well, just kind of tells us what she did, but do we know anything about how unique it was? Right? Had this ever been done before? We have no idea, right? So we cannot choose A. B says, if you guys chose A, then you're interpreting too much. You might be making stories up, right? Maybe you might be thinking, man, it's not very common to escape a place. It's not very common for a woman to be working in the army, right? If you think that way, you are making stories up, and you can't do that on the SAT. Right? So the SAT, you want to stick to what the passage says. Right? So you want to stick as closely to the words that you're given. Right. So we can get rid of A. B says, after escaping slavery, Taylor began working for an all-black army regiment as a nurse and teacher. So again, this is going to be wrong, right? I mean, it just tells us what she did, but do we know how unique it was? Right? Maybe it's an accomplishment, but do we know the uniqueness of the accomplishment? Right? And you might be thinking, again, if you're thinking, man, it's really hard she's got 2 jobs. She's a nurse and a teacher, right? Of course that's unique. Well, if you think that way, you're making stories up, right? You're making things up, and you can't do that. So we got to cross it out. C says, the book Taylor wrote about the time she spent with the regiment is still available to readers in print and online. Well, it tells us that it's still available, right? But does this tell us anything about her achievement? Right? Well, what is Taylor's accomplishment? Taylor's accomplishment isn't that the book is still available. That's not her accomplishment, right? That's just a fact about the book, right? So we know that C isn't going to be the correct answer. Now look at how D says. D says Taylor was the only Black woman, right, to publish a Civil War memoir, right? And that's exactly, it's just a paraphrase of what this note says, right? And that's the things too, is the answers will, just paraphrase what the notes say. So they'll never give you like inaccurate notes, at least none that I've seen so far. It doesn't mean the SAT can't do this. But notice too how the answer choice uses the word only, right? The only person to do something. So when you say you're the only one, you are emphasizing the uniqueness of something, right? By saying that there's no others, right? You're the only one. One of one is all. Okay, so this is why D here would be the correct answer to this question. All right, you guys, that'll do it for this video. So please, if you guys can do me this favor, please comment in the comment box below what you found helpful, if you found this to be helpful, or also let me know in the comment box just if there's something that you want to learn even more. If you felt like, man, I don't really know this very well yet still, and you want to learn it more, please let me know, you guys, okay? I have I'm really committed. So it's been a long day. I've been making these videos for you guys for about 6 hours or so now. And so my brain is about to shut down. But I am just, out here willing to do is whatever I can with the limited time that I do have. Of course, I wish I could make these scripts. Of course, I could make these videos better scripted. Of course, I wish I didn't stammer and stutter so much, but I really don't have the times to do that. And I hope that you guys can understand that. Hope that you guys can just really feel my wanting to help you guys out. Because I'm just really trying to get this information out to you guys who need it, and without trying to make it as pretty and as sort of YouTube friendly as possible, although that is going to be something I'll have to do in the future. Right now, I'm just trying to put out good content, trying to speak it to the best of my abilities. And I apologize for any sort of mistakes and stammers that I make, you guys. I hope that you guys are getting something valuable from this. Honestly, guys, if you guys are, learning one or two really helpful things in an hour, right? Think about what you'd be spending, right, on a tutor. Tutors, so tutors who have 15 years of experience, worked with over 7,000 students, taken the actual test multiple times, got a 99 percentile score. These tutors will charge anywhere from about $350 to about $600 an hour. I've seen some as high as, I think, $600 an hour. And so think about that. It's an hour, and you guys I'm one of those guys, I'm not bragging, but I am one of those guys who taken the test multiple times, scored 99th percentile, have books written on this stuff. I've taught for over 15 years, I've worked with over 7,000 students. And so it'd be around the price that I'd be charging is about $300 an hour, and so, just think about it and that frame it like that, and that'll really show you guys how much value you're getting, right, from these videos. I'm not holding anything back, as you guys can tell. It's not that I teach differently, right, and I'm teaching in a live setting. This is how I do things, right? This is how I explain stuff. And so hopefully you guys are getting some value from that. If you guys are, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Until next time, you guys, this is Jin Teacher signing off. Just always stay curious. Never stop learning, you guys. Take care. You guys got this. Bye.